Perfect. So yeah, I think we're live. I also have a chat open here in case anything goes wrong. My my manager Mohammed, he's going to be able to tell us if there's any issues with the links or not. But I
Perfect.
think I think at the moment we're pretty much good to go. So yeah, let's get started if that works for you. So hey there, everybody. Welcome to the AMA session for August 2023. We're very lucky to have Sandro Volpicella on the call with us today. We're going to be talking about serverless, AWS, and more. In particular, the book that he co-wrote with Tobias Schmidt. Before anything, I'd also like to apologize for my neighbors' construction work in the background. There's a bit of background noise, but I'll try to mute my microphone. Just a reminder, everyone who's watching live, this is a completely open and free AMA session. If you have any questions that you would like to ask Sandro at any point, just drop them in the chat. I'm going to try and curate them as we speak, as I ask my own questions. But I also have some team members here that will help me if there's any questions that get missed. So if you have something that you want to ask, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll be happy to get to it. So to introduce today's speaker, we're really lucky to talk with Sandro, who has a background in computer science, data, and analytics, and he's now a platform lead, a platform engineering lead at Hashnode. He's also a startup founder with ServerlessQ and a technical book author. And that's one of the things that we're going to be spending the most amount of time talking about here. I think it's safe to say that probably Sandro's two biggest professional passions, and correct me if I'm wrong, are probably serverless and AWS. Sandro writes a lot about both, and you can find his writing on his blog, which is appropriately hosted on Hashnode.
Of course.
And and then you can also catch some of his very interesting writing through the super insightful AWS Fundamentals newsletter, which is sent out on a weekly basis and breaks down a different AWS service every week. So Sandro, I'll pass it over to you. Is there anything I missed? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and who you are?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for the introduction. It was really nice. I think that's the nicest introduction I got so far. The newsletter is bi-weekly. The rest was correct. So weekly would be a bit too much, but bi-weekly it is. So yeah,
Okay.
really looking forward to this. I give you just a small 2-minute introduction of myself, maybe. Like Jake said, I'm Sandro Volpicella. I'm 29 years old, live in Munich, Germany, so right in the south of Germany. I think most of you who know Munich, it's most famous for the Oktoberfest and FC Bayern Munich. I'm a software engineer, focused a lot on serverless and cloud infrastructure, and I work as a platform engineering lead at Hashnode. As you said, Hashnode is a developer-focused blogging platform, so we provide you all the tools that you can create your blog, create content, and yeah, I'm doing most of the infrastructure and backend API stuff there with a small team, which is really great. Other than that, I love playing tennis, love doing sports, going with friends outside. And yeah, I think that's about the basics about me. I'm pretty sure we go into much more details in a few more minutes, but I really look forward to this. Thanks for the invitation.
Cool, sounds great. You've done a lot inside of the computer science world. I saw when I was looking through your background that your thesis was on machine learning, and you spent some time on data and analytics. But judging on what you spend your most amount of time doing now is more like obviously AWS and serverless. And that's what you write about a lot. What initially got you into serverless, and what makes it so compelling for you as an area of work at the moment?
Yeah, I think I go a few steps back because I started working in IT, I think 13 years ago it is now, because I did an apprenticeship when I was 16. So yeah, it was like 13 years ago. An apprenticeship in Germany, I think that's a pretty German type of education. It's like a college, just much more hands-on. So you work full-time in a company, and you have like a few days a week or a few weeks a year school where you learn some theoretical basics. And I did this as an IT system technician, so started really at the basics, I would say. You do a lot of IT support, a lot of printer installing, computer installing, stuff like that. And I really enjoyed it from day one to be in this computer science world. But after 2-3 years, after the apprenticeship especially, this gets quite boring, of course. So I continued doing a computer science study and moved to another city, studied the computer science in bachelor's. And that was a really cool time because you can see I could see every direction of computer science. If it was software engineering or like some quality management reporting or even then data science. And I had like 3-4 different roles, was in the UK for 6 months for an internship, and really fell in love with the whole software engineering and cloud architecture, I would say. And this is simply because I understood how to build a product out of that, because I saw it during my bachelor thesis, I think the one you've quoted, which was more in machine learning, data science area, which is really hyped now. It was hyped back then as well. And I did this one at BMW, so at the car manufacturer here in Munich. And I've built a machine learning model for predicting some passenger demand. So you know where to put in your Ubers basically at what time. And the amazing thing there was the colleagues I had were really familiar with how to build serverless stuff. So this is where I touched my first C# Lambda back then. And the nice thing there was also that I didn't just do my bachelor thesis, but I needed to build a product out of that. And this is what got me amazed, because with data science, you not only need your Jupyter notebooks and have some prediction in the end, but with building a product out of that, you needed to understand how to have an API, how to store your predictions on S3, how to put your application on CloudFront and stuff like that. So this is how I really learned the whole flow of building an application. And why I love this area so much is because I was able, with help from my mentors, of course, to build this by myself. And I think this is really what cloud and serverless is doing. It's like more democratizing how people can build globally available products. And this is what I really love. And this is why I stayed within this area for, I don't know, the last 5 years, and don't plan to do something else at the moment.
Very cool. Yeah, I totally identify with that. Like the applicability of the concepts make it just so much more appealing, right? The fact that you can learn something and then actively just build something that's actually working and you can share it and even like down the road make money off your own products and stuff. That's really, really interesting. A complete just side note that just came to my mind now, because you were talking about learning and studying computer science in Germany. What came to mind is my wife, she's a lawyer, and she has a few friends who are German lawyers, and she told me that a real kind of interesting peculiarity about studying law in Germany, which is that the bar or the kind of the exam to kind of the last step of becoming an accredited lawyer in Germany, I think it's like really high stakes. It's like a 2 exam thing, and the thing is you have 2 chances, and if you don't pass, you can never become a lawyer. Like you'll only be like a jurist or kind of like a law graduate. Is there anything in particular about the way computer science is taught in Germany that you're aware of being like quite German or quite kind of dissimilar to the way it's taught in other countries?
So about the law thing, I know this is really weird, because I also have a friend who studied this, and also like I think you need something like 4 points to pass, 15 points is max, and nobody ever reaches 7 points or something like that. So that's weird. About computer science, I'm not sure. So Germans are normally really focused on data privacy, data privacy, and doing things themselves. So you won't see many lectures about any fancy cloud technology or something like that out there. But I don't think it is. Basically, all our resources are still the normal algorithms and data structures book. The basic fundamentals everywhere, where it's taught everywhere. So I can't recall anything in particular where we Germans do the studies at least differently. The main thing is we have one study subject which I studied in undergraduate, which is computer science for business, Wirtschaftsinformatik it's called. And I think this is pretty German. Normally you study computer science or you study business and not some mixed match of that. But this is pretty popular to study in Germany.
Interesting. Yeah, cool. I'm just wondering, as a platform engineering lead at Hashnode, and Hashnode being a pretty interesting kind of relatively newcomer in the kind of like blogging platform space, and as a user of Hashnode, I'm a huge fan. I really enjoy the user experience is really good. I remember when the AI features were rolled out, it was super smooth, and there just seems to be like an ease of use and feature richness that's really cool. But what's it like on the inside? What's it like working for a blogging platform?
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. I pass it definitely to the team. On the inside, it's super interesting because I also used Hashnode before I was part of Hashnode or before I joined Hashnode. And I also love the product. And this is, I would say, also the main interesting fact being internal that you see we are 12 developers. We're about, I think, 18 or 19 people in general working at Hashnode. And everybody is the user of Hashnode. Everybody is using the product actively. Everybody used it before. Everybody loves to improve it. And this is something I never have seen before, to be honest, because everybody uses the product and replies to tweets and is active on Twitter and wants to be in the community. This is just where also the urge comes from shipping things and wanting to improve it and seeing the whole long-term future of it. So that's really cool. I think the second part, what is really interesting on the inside is, like I said, we are not even 20 people, but we have, I think, 3 to 4 million page views a month. We have lots of users. We have a huge community out there, which, like you said, love the product. And we are just 12 engineers building that. And I think this is also because we're in the great time of serverless. We can use something like Vercel. We can make use of something like EventBridge, AWS, stuff like that. And yeah, you can really see how huge the impact of just one single developer is. So this is what I really love.
Incredible. Yeah, like I remember anytime when you're trying to work on something that's like a personal project of your own, and then it doesn't work out, or you think to yourself, yeah, but why did I give up on that project that I was working on? If you ask yourself the question, like, would you use that if you were like if you weren't the creator, if you were a user, is that something that actually appeals to you? Many times the answer is no. And sometimes that happens at where you work too. Like, would you actually be a user of that? So when that kind of you're the user of something that you're building, when that kind of marriage happens, I can imagine it being very cool.
Exactly. That is a huge difference. That's really cool.
And speaking of other things that you have been a creator of, and before we get into the book, I just wanted to quickly touch on ServerlessQ, which is a project that you created. Now, honestly speaking, if you weren't the creator, would you be a user? Probably yes, right?
Yeah, definitely yes. It's kind of hard because I would be on the one side, but on the other side, I'm like working in AWS, kind of an AWS expert or developer. So, and it abstracts away AWS for a higher price, of course. So, yeah, it depends. For my side projects, I use it, but for like a high scale thing, I would probably still do it on AWS, to be honest, because I know how to do it. But yeah, I can give you the story of ServerlessQ in a second if you want.
Yeah, because I was just going to ask, like, what would be the main use case for ServerlessQ? Like, is it like a direct competitor, like an open source version of SQS?
Competitor, yes. Open source, not. So and also not directly a competitor, because with SQS you can do a lot of things, and SQS is really strong. But we abstract away SQS. So basically, what ServerlessQ is an HTTP message queue, and cron job service. So you have a REST API, and if you want to create a background task, so we care all about only background tasks. If you want to queue a background task or schedule a background task, you send it to our API and we send it back to your consumer. So to your API function, for example. And how I came up with ServerlessQ was while building Hashnode, because I joined Hashnode beginning of last year and put all the AWS resources we had into a huge CDK project, and then onboarded some new developers on the team. And then we wanted to include, for example, an audio version of a blog post, so to schedule some background task. And then I explained them you need to check out this repository. We have sandbox accounts, we have IAM, CloudWatch logs are there, you need to create a Lambda function. And at some point I realized, okay, I simply want to call a schedule one background function and not learn the whole of AWS. I have my whole application on Vercel, and I want to schedule something in the background. And this is simply not possible with AWS because you have so much overhead. And this is when I said, okay, we need some kind of REST API to do this easily and to have some functionality like retries, like schedules, like dead letter queues and all of that. And this is what we are building with ServerlessQ. We just released yesterday evening the second SDK, so to make it much more tightly with Next.js. And it's a really cool project, but of course having a SaaS on the side is also intense, but it is definitely interesting to see. And we have about 400 users now, so that's a really nice story so far.
Incredible. Yeah, so many of the AMA sessions that I have with creators it's a boring question to ask, but the question just always kind of pops into my head. It's like, how do you have the time to do all that? Because like we're not even talking about the main subject for today, but yeah, incredible. Very interested to see the evolution of ServerlessQ. So moving on to the main topic, what was the desire? What brought you to write AWS for the real world with Tobias Schmidt?
Good question. So basically what we both started out with our own blogs. I think back then Toby had some Medium blog, I had my Hashnode blog. We were both pretty active on Twitter. I think Toby was most famous for his infographics on Twitter. And content creation is a pretty lonely game. So I always reach out to fellow creators who are in the same boat and just talk to them. So at some point we've met online, I think, and Toby just lives 2 hours away from me, but we didn't know this then. And we talked a bit about it and talked about joining forces, but we had no idea how, to be honest. So we had never a book in mind or a course in mind. We just wanted to create content free without any idea what to do. But at some point, we saw that there are like the same questions from the audience over and over again. And what really stuck out to us is that most of them or many of them have certifications. And many of them even have like good certifications, much higher certifications than we have. And we had the same experience at work. Back then I was at the IT consultancy and everybody was like certified with 10 different certifications, but had no idea how to use SQS. And that doesn't make sense for me. And we were both pretty lucky how we learned AWS. Like I said, with BMW, we had direct colleagues from AWS, and Toby had the same thing, just other car manufacturer. And then we decided to do some product or some project about the fundamentals and the best practices, but even for the real world and not for certifications. That was the whole idea about this. And this is where the desire came from, because we said, hey, AWS is a one-time learning. Dex likes to say this a lot. And you learn it once and you apply the same concepts over and over again, depending on your use case. And this one-time learning can really benefit you so much in terms of job perspective, but also in terms of building your own projects and shipping things fast. So yeah, this is why we thought of creating this book and how we did it then.
Very cool. And sorry, this just came to mind now. When you say that, you learn it once, you learn the fundamentals once, and then you just apply it for the different use cases along your career. How transferable do you think? I know the specific scope of this book is AWS, but how transferable do you think the fundamentals could be applied to other cloud providers? Do you think that there's underlying fundamentals that I know that like the name of the services and like some features of the services may change, but if someone were to pick up this book, how fundamentally ready would they be able to understand cloud in general?
Yeah. So we have a section at the beginning for who is this book for, who is this book not for. So obviously, if you want to learn Azure or GCP, I wouldn't recommend buying AWS Fundamentals. But if you have the fundamentals of any cloud provider, then you can use SNS on GCP. So I think PubSub on Azure, it's something with notifications. So the basics are the same. In the end, AWS is launching something, the other two are building it, or vice versa. So you have the fundamentals, they are applicable and transferable. I think the fun part is Toby is not even working with AWS at the moment, or not full-time working with AWS. He works with Azure a lot. So, and he also had like the basics of AWS and transferred them to Azure. So yeah, it is definitely also transferable, the knowledge you have before. You need to REST API, TCP, HTTP, all of that stuff, networking, subnets is still the same. The thing about AWS is just you abstract it a bit more and you put it more into services and APIs in the end.
I just out of curiosity, from your experience, would you equate the differences between the different cloud providers, but yet since they're built on the same kind of fundamentals of compute and networking, that like the OCI model doesn't change regardless of the cloud provider that you're in? Would you equate it to like the same differences between different coding languages, or are they kind of closer, like the differences between GCP and AWS, as opposed to like, I don't know, like Python?
I'm not too sure about it, because with coding languages you can have, so if you talk about GCP, Azure, and AWS, and I don't know, assembler, C, and TypeScript, it is a big difference if you use a pointer on C and like TypeScript, do whatever you want. I wouldn't say you can compare it like that. I think AWS is still, in terms of serverless services, really, really good and like at the forefront. But GCP, for example, is at the forefront of container services and container as a service with their things. So I'm not sure. I don't think you can compare it like that exactly.
Perfect. Yeah, no, sorry, that just came off the top of my head, I probably would agree with that. How would you recommend for people to pick up this book? Is it a cover to cover read, or because you do a really, really good job of breaking down, and I know you probably could have written a lot more for each core service, but you break down a lot of the core services in a good amount of detail. Would you recommend people to pick it up whenever they're like a little bit rusty on a particular service, or to read it from
that's a good one, because once you buy the book, we have a Lambda in the background which adds you to our newsletter service, and if you accept the newsletter, of course, then you are in an email sequence, and the first email you get after 1 day is how should you read this book, which exactly talks about this question. And we kind of have 3 ways. The one way is just from the beginning to end, and I think this is the most obvious way if you are completely new to AWS and you're just interested. You're interested in the technology. You want to know what is it everybody talks about on AWS, what can you do with it? And we have like these broad categories from database and storage, networking, events, and messaging. So I think if you want to have the broad overview, it's pretty good to simply go from the beginning to end. The second way would be to pick a chapter. So for example, messaging and events, or a service that you actually need. We had this feedback a lot. Somebody's on a client project. The client is saying, the customer is saying, hey, I need to decouple my architecture. My APIs are super slow. Let's decouple them a bit. How can I do this on AWS? Please do this. So, and then I would say, read about events, read about messaging, understand what SQSS and as event bridges, and you have a full picture of like how you can do this, in which steps it makes sense. This would be like the second part. And the third part is what I also quite like, is we have a Discord community similar to Tailwarden with about 400 people in there. And you can also combine the community, the building aspect, and the book. So we have lots of examples in there. And I think the main thing is to start building during reading. So this is the only way you actually learn it. We say it's for the real world. So you won't know everything if you just read the book. So you need to apply it somewhere. And the best case is if you just talk about it on the community or create blog posts about it on Hashnode or something like that. Just this is a much better learning. So this whole learning in public thing really makes sense here, because you get so much feedback and so much suggestions and feedback from the community. And you always find somebody who's like in the exact same step and the exact same struggle.
Very, very cool. Yeah, I wasn't aware of the Discord community, but that's an incredible aspect for the applicability of the book, because I must admit, I do have a few referenced technical books that I read. Not a lot of them are nice reads from cover to cover, because they're not really like set out to be that way. But I must admit that your book is quite easy to read from cover to cover, if that's the way you want to do it. But knowing that there's a community there that are using it as kind of like an instruction manual to have at the side as you build a real project, that's a very, very cool resource to additionally have. Just moving on, I was wondering, we touched on the fact that you could have written a lot more about many services, but is there one in particular that you had to kind of like hold your kind of fingers while you were typing to not write a lot more? Because a lot of the chapters are very concise and very kind of like to the point. Which one did you struggle with the most?
Yeah, I would say the MongoDB. So I have a few of them in mind where I struggled a lot. But then MongoDB, I have like this love-hate relationship with it. I love it, but then I don't know, I built another project with it. I built a project recently with single table design, and at some points you can make things wrong so easily on the MongoDB. And the console, it tries to improve, but it's still not great. Fetching data, doing access patterns and stuff like that. And I started writing this chapter, and we did it in Notion, so we always saw the word count. And it was like 7K words or 8K words at some point. I said, okay, we can't put this out. It's either way too much, so not enough focus narrowed down, or just way too advanced for a beginner book. But like other services, I would say, where we struggled a bit to focus on the core assets are like IIM and CloudWatch, because these are services everybody needs. So everybody who works somehow with AWS touches these services and should touch them. But CloudWatch, for example, is a suite of products. You have 15 different products in CloudWatch, and you can make so many examples and show so much with logs and metrics. So this was really something where we needed to focus and where we rewritten a lot. So the MongoDB, I think this chapter was read and rewritten, I don't know, 15 times at least.
Yeah. I can kind of like tell there's a couple of paragraphs that you can tell that there was a lot more there. Just moving on to you talk also at the beginning of the book, rightly so, and I'm really happy that you touch on it, about calculating costs, or just being aware of costs, setting budget alerts, and using the AWS tooling around cost awareness, and that's and that's really cool, because a lot of people who maybe start out with the cloud, or are not as aware of how the cloud works. It's pretty much just like a menu, right? Like you have so many different items that you can choose, you can provision, and then you realize, oh, that's kind of expensive if it's not used correctly. So would you have any recommendations on how to say, for example, if you're starting out with a new project that you know it's going to be big and it's going to be built completely on serverless, how could you like pre-calculate the costs or the cost projection for a serverless app? Would you have any tips for, and then maybe like afterwards, once it's running, how would you lower the costs?
So first of all, the pricing calculator is the obvious way to go. So AWS has a pricing calculator of not all services, but most of the services at least. And there you see, and there you can understand how pricing works. But the thing here also is you need to understand. So first of all, I would start with the obvious things. You build an application, you have API gateway, Lambda, DynamoDB, Event Bridge, for example. So you know you use these services, so understand how are they built. Most of them are usage-based, so you need to understand how many requests you get. This is the first assumption you need to take, which is super hard. So that's not an easy one. I don't think many companies or applications know this beforehand. Then on the obvious thing is also understand what one request means, because in Event Bridge, one event is not one event. One event is an event of, I don't know, 64 kilobyte, for example. If you have 65 kilobyte, it's 2 events. So then you know how much is in your event, for example. And you can spin this off. This can get really complicated. Same thing with DynamoDB. I mean, DynamoDB, you have WSUs and you have read and write units. And understanding what a read unit is until which kilobyte limit is not that straightforward. So this is something crucial, because it can mean you have 100 write units, or it can mean you have 1,000 write units if it's too big. So understand the unit AWS is calculating with. And that's not always super easy, but they're improving on their pricing sector. And then there's hidden things. I think this is the most important part, or some important part, is I see in serverless applications the number one cost driver often is CloudWatch. And nobody calculates for CloudWatch, because you simply put your logs in there, you hopefully have some structured logger, a JSON logger, and you log just everything. And you don't know how many kilobytes or how many megabytes these are, so you don't calculate for it. And then the ingestion on CloudWatch is pretty expensive. But you need CloudWatch. Also, if you need a third party, you still need to put it into CloudWatch most of the times. And the ingestion is expensive, not the storage. So keep this in mind and try to calculate it, use log levels and stuff like that. And then the last one is, I think, data transfer. Bandwidth is super expensive often. So how much goes in and out of internet to AWS, how much is across data centers, all of that can also be expensive. You also need to be aware of that. But like I said, to calculate these things, I wouldn't say, so I never have a 100% opinion where I'm sure this application will cost this much. So it is a bit hard.
Just quickly, speaking of the CloudWatch log persistence, are there any particular life cycle policies that you use by default for persisting the logs? Like, is there any real reason, in your opinion, to have them for more than 3 or 4 months?
No. So what I always do is, especially Lambda and CloudWatch, if you create a Lambda function, it automatically creates a log group without any retention period. So if you create a Lambda function together with a CloudWatch group with the same name and the prefix /AWS/Lambda, then it automatically goes into this. The logs go into this log group, and you can set a retention period on this one. But the important part is, this is what I've meant, is the ingestion is really important, not the storage, really expensive. So the ingestion won't change with the retention period, because this is only about storage. Storage is still doesn't make sense to keep them forever, and it's also too expensive. But keep in mind the ingestion if you build it and if you want to calculate it.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks a million for sharing that. As an AWS expert, which you can probably call yourself now at this stage, and from your experience using it and building on the cloud provider, what would be kind of your main critiques? What do you think AWS is lacking the most? What does it not do that well? So and just like, and we can keep it to things like serverless. What's your like? Can step functions improve, for example, or cloud cost calculation? Is Cost Explorer enough, for example?
Yeah. So in general, I think AWS is famous for not having the best developer experience and having a pretty ugly console. I think everybody most of the times agrees on that. But I also think in general it's important to understand where AWS is coming from, and they are an infrastructure provider. So they started out with giving you SQS, then S3, then virtual machines and stuff like that. And having one unique console over every other service, I think that's pretty hard. So I kind of understand why things are how they are, to some extent at least. They can definitely improve on some things. And you said costs, for example. What I hate about AWS and why newcomers hate AWS is you don't have a hard limit. You have a free tier, which is for the first year. Then you have a free tier, which is always just on a monthly basis. So and then you have these account limits where AWS says they save you if you do something wrong, but still you read these horror stories on Reddit and everywhere where you just pay way too much and somebody hacks into your account and then you pay 60K and then you need to pray that AWS is nice and says you don't need to pay it. So having a hard limit, and so even a hard limit and they can shut down your resources, I think this would be the way to go for development accounts, because not everybody's aware of that if you put your credit card in there that you need to pay. The Cost Explorer, I like it, but I use Tailwarden now as well for ServerlessQ. So that's of course on another level of understanding your costs and understanding how much your tables cost and stuff like that. It is, if you use Cost Explorer and if you use the reports, you really need to put in some work with tags and everything to get it working. So I think they can improve, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert on getting costs across organizations and accounts. On the serverless side, I would say one thing that would be good is to define what serverless is for AWS. They had some recent launches like OpenSearch, like serverless databases, and nobody knows. I really looked forward to a search which is serverless because I hate all other searches. But if they don't scale to zero, if they cost me $400 a month, for me, that's not serverless. For me, that's not usage-based. So I would like them to be a bit more careful by using the word serverless and what it actually is. And on the other side, understanding developer experience a bit better and giving maybe some more opinionated advice. Like you always have 15 different ways of doing things. You can, if you want to host a Docker container, it's insane how many ways there are. If you want to decouple your architecture, what I said, there are many ways. It would be cool to give some opinionated advice. And the EventBridge team is doing an amazing job here. They have David Boney, for example. They have a blog. They show you so much stuff. So I think this could benefit AWS a lot. But we also have to see these are opportunities for companies like Tailwarden, Vercel, I don't know, ServerlessQ to come in and do it better. So, well, for content creators to create content about that, to create workshops, books, and stuff around that. So this can also be seen as an opportunity to build things ourselves and let AWS improve the infrastructure, because this is what they do quite well.
Yeah, and I totally agree with your initial statement that AWS is an infrastructure provider, and they do that very, very well. I mean, we talk about, and in the book you talk about the core services, but I was just looking at a recent list of all of the new services that AWS shipped that I've never even like opened up the console to, and like the amount of work that's going on in the background that we don't see is incredible. So the fact that we have certain gripes about certain services that we use a lot not being exactly the way we want them, it kind of makes sense. But on the topic of criticizing AWS. One of the best people that does it with very fair criticisms is Corey Quinn from the Duckbill group. And I remember reading one of his blog posts that I wanted to quickly ask you about. This was, I think, a blog post that he wrote last year. I'll try to find it and I'll add it to the description of the video. But the main message of the blog post was that since AWS is around, since 2006, the messaging has been on towards trying to appeal to companies to migrate from their on-prem infrastructure over to the cloud. And I'm asking you about this because there's a really interesting use case in the book where you talk about this particular practice of transferring over, migrating over. And he says that there is a point where, and he's writing this in 2022, like there is a point that the messaging should change, right? Because there's only a certain amount of companies out there. There's only a certain amount of companies that are still on-prem. And if they're on-prem still, that means they're probably never going to migrate over to the cloud. And in his opinion, AWS is losing the opportunity to change the messaging towards startups, towards companies that don't have any existing infrastructure right now, and they could benefit a lot from making it much easier for startups to use the AWS to the fullest of the fullest of their capacities, and they could like change the way education, they could change the way certifications are kind of, because the amount of certifications that still ask questions about cloud migrations. What's your opinion on this? Should the messaging change there?
So I get where this is coming from, definitely, but I also, if I see my perspective working at a huge cloud consultancy or a huge enterprises before, there are just so many migrations, and there is just, I believe there is a lot of money within these migrations. So I understand why AWS is doing this, because migrations are kind of probably harder than building greenfield projects, so definitely harder. I would like to see a bit of a different message as well, because I know they have solution architects just for startups. I know they have this AWS Activate program where like small projects like mine or also huge projects like Hashnode get funded or get AWS credits, not funded. But we don't have any contact to AWS, for example. So it is kind of weird that like even as a huge company or early stage startup which grows a lot, nobody reaches out to. So we're not really in contact with anybody there. And this is quite different for other companies like huge enterprises. On the other side, I'm also not sure. Corey Quinn has probably the better data, but I think I can think of one study where it said like e-commerce companies are just migrated 50% of their workloads to the cloud, and there's still many more to go. So I think in our bubble, we think everything is on the cloud, but I'm pretty sure there's lots to go. But I'm not sure if like e-commerce will use Shopify or will use AWS then, but that's another story. So in general, if they would change the messaging to startups a bit more and supporting them and giving them some resources in terms of people and more opinionated documents and like opinionated services and architectures especially, I think this could help a lot. Yeah, pretty sure he's right there. But I'm not sure if they make more money with that. It's another story.
Yeah, exactly. Before we move on, we just have a question from a LinkedIn user, and he asks, or she, given that AWS is designed to make it easy for big organizations to consume lots of cloud resources, would adding hard limits conflict with that design purpose?
Yeah, so I need to be a bit clearer on that. What I've meant with hard limits is you have different accounts normally, and it would be great if I start out with a development account and I say, okay, I want to have a hard limit of $100 a month, and after that you are allowed to shut down all of my resources. So, and in a production environment, you can't have a hard limit. You still can have it, but probably should not have it, because exactly of this issue, then it won't scale that much anymore. But one thing to be also aware of if you have a huge application and you're new in AWS is that you have service limits, regional limits, and account limits, and they are there to safeguard certain things. For example, you have some number of allowed concurrent executions of your Lambda functions. And these limits can often be lifted, but if you don't know about them and you don't have any CloudWatch alerts about them, this will also stop scaling. So this will also be kind of a hard shutdown of your application. But yeah, a hard limit on production environment in a big organization, this wouldn't make sense probably. But on a dev environment and on my single account for, I don't know, ServerlessQ or for whatever I'm doing, it would be good that I know I'm not broke in the next week.
Exactly. Cool. Thanks for clearing that up, and thanks a million for the question. So I'm aware of the time. We're 45 minutes in, and I know you've been really generous. But I have one more question before moving on to the game that I like to do, overrated, underrated. Sorry. Oh well, let's just. We have the last follow-up here. Oh, it's Eric. So Eric asked, so if I'm understanding you, the hard limit would be opt-in for development accounts only.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say if it's possible, I'm not sure. I think about Firebase or GCP, I think it's possible on there that you say, okay, you're now only on the free tier. You don't need to pay for anything. You don't even need to attach a CC. I think that's on Firebase. And if you put it onto production, and you always have a hard warning to say, hey, don't do this in production. But if you then put it on production, you could say, okay, here's my CC, here's my credit card. Now you're allowed to spend money, and now you are aware of spending money in case it scales. But if you're just doing a prototype and on accident you have an S3 notification on Lambda and Lambda is updating S3 and stuff like that, so this can be pretty expensive pretty fast. So this is where I'd like to have some hard limits.
Perfect. Thanks a million. And thanks again for the question, Eric. Moving on to the last question before we get to overrated, underrated. The book does an incredible job at breaking down and talking about the different kind of like core applications, the core AWS services. And I'm guessing if someone is already a cloud engineer working and has access to a complex AWS infrastructure, they'll have a lot to kind of like dig into, try to understand and have direct access to that. But for someone, for example, a cloud engineer who's unemployed or just starting out, how would you recommend, and I think you already even touched on this, a good resource could potentially be this Discord group. But what other resources could people have to try out like hands-on POCs and to learn how to build their own personal projects to get kind of their hands dirty?
So what for resources? So in general, what I think how they can benefit the most or like go to the next level is by building. This is what I've already touched on earlier. And what I would focus on is, it depends on what your job is, of course, but what I would focus on is build an end-to-end solution. Build something which has an API, which has, I don't know, asynchronous processing with Event Bridge, which has a S3 bucket cloud front and a front end. And then you can, in a database. And then you see the whole flow, and you also understand how to trace something, for example. So you have user requests coming in, they are going to CloudWatch, how to use X-Ray, all of these things that are pretty important to understand. And for example, idempotency, you will understand then once you use something async. And all of these connected but distributed components can get quite confusing if you start in a company which has already 1 million requests a day. But if you do it on a small scale, this can really benefit you to understand what is going on and to see the interaction of the whole requests. I think advanced resources, there are amazing blogs out there. So our blog is more for the fundamentals, like it's the name. But if you want to go more advanced, Jan Choi, I think he's the serverless king, has an amazing blog. Jeremy Daly, run Eisenberg, all of James Daly, I think. Jeremy Daly. And yeah, there are a few blogs. I can give you the link. Maybe you can put them in the show notes. They're definitely amazing. And Twitter is still a good place for following them or the AWS blog itself is also pretty good. So I think these are all good examples to level it up, but in the end, build and put yourself out there and create content about this, because this will have an immense impact.
Exactly. And yeah, I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes fail to act just because of the amount of resource, the amount of like possibilities out there. And would you recommend anything in particular around like generating ideas for projects, or do you think that there's so many different projects that you could do?
Not 100 generating ideas. Yeah, not sure. There, like, what is a really good place? What is a really good place is AWS Workshops. I think it's workshops.aws. There you have ideas and most of the time also code you can use, you can execute, and then using a workshop, taking a workshop and rebuilding it in infrastructure as code. This is something I did at the beginning as well. I don't know, something was in Terraform and I put it into CDK, trying without checking, just copying the Terraform code. But going to this website, you will have an amazing free resource of I don't know how many workshops. And there are amazing workshops. And these workshops are normally done with companies. So there are immersion days of AWS. They take a workshop, go to a company, I don't know, for 2 days, and they learn it together. So they have a really good quality.
Amazing. That sounds exactly a good source of ideas. Perfect. So I'll definitely take you up if you can send those links to the blogs that you mentioned, and also to the AWS workshops. We'll add them to the show notes. That'll be perfect.
Nice.
So perfect. So if there's any other questions in the from the community, feel free to ask them. But while you do, I'm just going to move on to my favorite part, which is overrated, underrated. So here, just feel free. You can answer with a word, or you can give us a bit more an in-depth response if you feel like it. But I'm just going to shoot something out, and you can tell me if your general opinion is that if it's underrated or overrated.
Okay.
The first one is the concept of digital and kind of like updatable books. I remember the first book that I saw of this kind was The Network State from Balaji Srinivasan, in which the book is online, and you can read it online, and it reads like an actual book, like you can see the chapters. But the main idea is that it's pretty much like code. Like there's a repository which is the source of truth for the book, and it kind of like updates on a regular cadence. Well, whenever there's updates for the books. Is this something that? Well, I was going to turn it into a question, but yeah, overrated.
Underrated, I would say. Underrated. We also thought about doing it with, like I said, we wrote it with Notion. Thought about doing this, not sure how to do this, to be honest, or just put it in HTML, but underrated. That's updating the book. For us, we are doing it at the moment, is a pain. And I think the customer with interactions and visualizations and stuff has much more benefit by having it interactive on the web.
Yeah, and also I saw an interesting one of the latest newsletters of yours that you put out. You mentioned that one of the newest, or one of the first updates to the original book, is going to come out at the same time as the product hunt launch.
Exactly. We didn't do a product hunt launch for the book, and now we do we were aware that we need to do an update because it's our first book. So we're doing this right now, or the last 2 months, I would say, fixing typos, grammar, and making more consistent images. And this comes out together with the product hunt launch. The plan is 8th of September, next week, Thursday, I think, because then Toby's at my place. We work on another project, and then we do it together with a beer. That's good.
Very nice. Yeah, we'll also add the link to that in the show notes.
Nice.
Next one, AWS IQ.
I think underrated still. I never used it because when I was a freelancer, it was not available in Europe. But I know Adam, I think if you say AWS IQ, it's always Adam, forgot his last name, the one who's
Oh,
doing the podcast How About Tomorrow with Dex.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, he shared how much he earned with AWS IQ and how many projects he got. So that's amazing. But I think for this you need a lot of certifications. Like Adam did all 12. So don't follow the advice of the random internet guy. Then do your certifications if you want to get some projects on there.
Yeah, Adam Elmore, I think
Elmore.
is
Oh yeah, yeah.
exactly. But yeah, he did the 12 and I think he did it in like record time. But I think to be eligible, you just need one, right?
Yeah.
And then once I think it's probably kind of like easier to find customers if you have more. But I could definitely see somebody like pairing like if they wanted to ramp up and potentially be a freelancer in the future, pairing their work with your book. I think that would be a really good way to ramp up for projects like that can be
Definitely,
found
yeah.
on AWS IQ. Overrated, underrated, Oktoberfest.
Oh, overrated. So I love it. I go there when it does start, I think 16th of September or something. So in 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm always there out with my family and friends on the first day. But overrated. Don't come to Munich because of the Oktoberfest. But
And
yeah, it's still nice. But have you been there?
well, to be honest, I've been to the second, really randomly, I've been to the second largest Oktoberfest in the
Yeah.
world, which is in the south of Brazil, in my
In the world,
girlfriend's,
yeah.
yeah, which is in my girlfriend's city. It's called Blumenau. If you look it up on Google, you'll see these crazy German, like
Okay.
Bavarian buildings. I mean, it looks like you're in some small town in Bavaria. But yeah, they're very proud of their Oktoberfest there.
Yeah.
What about lederhosen? Like, would you? Are they comfortable? Like, would you ever like wear them outside of the Oktoberfest?
Yeah, I do, of course. Yeah, so I grew up in Bavaria, so I have a full Bavarian family. I don't wear them often, but we have like for, I don't know, we have some weddings which are in like traditional clothing. We have some, if you go out, yeah, that's maybe, if you meet for like a white sausage breakfast, it's like a pretty German Bavarian thing. Then it happens that you wear just a lederhosen and a shirt or something like that, but it's super comfortable because yeah, it's leather, so you don't need to wash them. You can just put everything on there. They're nice and comfy.
Nice, but it never occurred during the pandemic that you were a little bit bored working from home and you're like, nah, I'll just work
Nah.
wearing lederhosen today.
I don't know if I would sit down with my lederhosen on my normal chair. So, so if you go to Oktoberfest, then you probably know what I mean. But
Okay.
yeah, no, sometimes we wear them more often than people think.
Okay, cool. And last one, overrated, underrated, the surfing that can be done in um sorry, I'm gonna get this wrong, but
Eisbach.
Eisbach
Oh,
Garden Park.
oh yeah, Eisbach. It's like a thing, a river from the Isar. Yeah, we have this underrated. So we have this huge wave. I think there's a stone or something under the bridge, and then there's like water coming over it, and it's really nice. I can't do it, so I never surfed in my life, but I like to watch it. So if somebody's visiting me in Munich, I always go there and show it to them because there's always a crowd. You can buy a beer there, sit down and look at the people surfing. It's a really nice vibe. And it's really cool that you also live in a city where you see people on a bike with a surfboard just going to the Isar for lunchtime and then heading back to work. That's cool.
Very cool indeed. Just a couple of outro questions and then I'll give you back your time. You've been very generous so far with it.
Yeah, no worries.
How bullish are you on AWS in general, like in the coming 10 years, for example?
And still very bullish. So definitely, I think it will still increase a lot. maybe on different ways. I hope on a bit different ways, like more into serverless, more into cloud native, more into these directions. But I'm also very bullish on people improving the development workflow. I think the best example here is serverless stack, like what Dex and Frank are building. It is amazing that they simply use native AWS tools. Like with their version 2, they use the API gateway that is provisioned always, so they don't need a debug stack anymore. Like these nitty-gritties that people are there, figure them out, put them open source, and finance themselves, hopefully with a second product. It's amazing. So I'm very bullish on also companies abstracting things away from AWS and making the life easier, but still having the benefits of shipping fast, focusing on the core and your application.
Perfect. Thanks a million. And last question on my part would be, I really love some of the sections, the majority of the sections of the book. At the end, you have, instead of saying like best practices or like things to remember, you call them like tips and tricks for the real world. And I really like that. If we think about a young cloud architect or cloud engineer, what like 3 tips and tricks would you like, and more focused on AWS, would you recommend for them to be successful in the coming years?
So one is definitely what I said, building. Just of course read something, understand what you're doing, but you will only understand it if you will apply it. So build it and put it out there, and then understand what you're doing. So this would be the number one: build something, put it into production, whatever production is for you then. The second one, like I said, AWS tips, right? Because I would say put yourself out there, what I said earlier, because the immense benefit what I have for putting myself out there, even if you're maybe sometimes wrong or afraid that you're wrong, and what I see Toby has and some other colleagues have, this is insane. This will literally change your life and hopefully a better direction what you want. For AWS, learn infrastructure as code. That's I think that's in the book also. Kind of a few times. You won't go to a company, you won't put something hopefully into production if it's not infrastructure as code. So understand what CloudFormation is, what Terraform is, Pulumi. Take one of these and build with it, because it is nice to click ops and to do your things, but you won't go into any company without using infrastructure as code. And then the third one is understand the basics. So understand how to use a terminal, understand what SSH is. I hope you don't need it anymore to SSH into some VM, but still understand how requests are coming in, what TCP is like these basics, they should still be there to some extent. I don't know the OSI layer by heart as well, but at least to understand how something is working out, some requests are flowing, networking and subnets and stuff like that is definitely something you should know if you want to work in computer science.
Perfect. So just to recap, it's building, putting yourself out there, and the fundamentals along with infrastructure as code, because like nowadays there's some companies that they even like put IAM restrictions on even like being allowed to provision anything.
I think Steady is doing this.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Perfect. So very concise and very valuable and helpful advice as always. Sandro, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks a million for taking the time again.
Thank you so much as well. Really appreciate it.
I'm really happy to see the updates of the book. I know for one that I'm going to be using it to build out my personal POCs and to because again, like similar to you, I got a certification, the Cloud Associate, the Cloud Architect Associate, which is actually going to expire if it hasn't already expired this August actually. And yes, and even going through that experience and actually working with AWS on a day-to-day basis, unless you practice it, unless you build, it really kind of atrophies. So thanks a million for being an inspiration to do that. Catch you next time.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
Cool. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.